Hey everyone, now we're gonna make something that I like to make a lot in my house. It's potato scallion bread. This recipe is pretty straightforward. A lot of people, I think, are intimidated to make bread at home, where this recipe is really simple, so it shouldn't intimidate anybody. If you follow the steps I'm gonna show you, they're really simple. So I got a mixing bowl for a stand mixer with a hook attachment on it ready to go. I got some warm water. This water is it's above body temperature, so you just run the tap and run your fingers under the water until you can feel the warmth a little bit. And then I have yeast. This is dry active yeast. This is not instant yeast. So what we do is I just sprinkle it from a height here. And that way it sits on top of the water. If you add it in all one go, then it will end up in a clump and it won't activate properly. So this step is going to be called blooming the yeast or activating the yeast. So you're just going to let that sit there for about 10 minutes. Let the yeast and the water kind of start working together to become activated. And I'll show you what that looks like when it's ready. We also have an egg we're going to add to the dough. We have salt, kosher salt, and black pepper I like to add to this bread, along with all-purpose flour. You could use bread flour if you like, but all-purpose is what most people have in their houses ready to go, so that's what we'll use. I have a couple Yukon Gold potatoes that I baked in the oven and chilled. So they're just plain baked potatoes. And they're cubed up like this. And then they have one whole bunch of green onions or scallions. So that's 6 green onions in a bunch. Just cut the roots off and slice them. And then I have a little extra flour for dusting later. So we'll come back when this is ready to go, the yeast, and we'll go take it from there. All right, it's been about 10 minutes. So the yeast is ready to go. You want to take a look? So a little bit of foam on the top there. You can mix it up. It's cloudy as well. That's a good sign until it's ready to go. We're gonna add an egg. This is a large egg, and I'm just gonna kind of help the mixer along just a bit and whisk it up. You don't have to whisk it up a whole lot, but enough. So I got my salt and pepper and my flour. I'm just gonna add it all at once in here. See, it's so easy, eh? Then my salt and pepper. I wouldn't add the salt to the yeast itself because it will actually keep it from activating. It will kill the yeast. Yeast and salt directly together don't mix very well. And then I'm gonna add half of these potatoes. Some of the green onions made it in there, but that's okay too. The reason I'm doing that is because I want the potato to flavor the dough and mix in and kind of give it a little bit of a texture. I also want some chunks of potato, so I'm gonna add this in at the end as we're shaping the dough. So I want a little bit of both worlds there. Then you go over to the mixer. We got a hook attachment, and we're just gonna put it on a low speed to start because you don't want the flour to go all over the place on you. Then when it starts to come together a little bit, you can turn up the speed just a little bit. And wouldn't want to go much higher than maybe medium speed as it's mixing. Turn up the speed a little bit. Okay. Now the amount of flour I put in this recipe is kind of a starting point, so you may need to add a little more flour or a little more water depending on the humidity in the air or the moisture in the potatoes or the moisture in the flour itself. Believe it or not, flour has moisture content, so if it's too dry, then just add a little water. If it's too sticky, then add a little flour and let it keep going until it's mixed together. So that looks pretty good. You don't want to jump the gun and add a little water before you have to, or else you might end up with too much of a sticky dough. But I think this looks pretty good. Once it actually comes together properly, then we'll let it mix together at this speed for about 8 to 10 minutes. Okay, so we're out of the mixing bowl. If you don't have a mixer, so this is how the dough should look like. It's a little tiny bit sticky, which is what we want. It means there's enough moisture content in there. You want it to be smooth, and you want it to be somewhat, like, not too tough. You don't want it to be too tough so you can't work with it, right? Anyway, if you don't have a mixing machine, this is how you could do it. You can mix everything I just showed you in a bowl, and then when you get all the flour absorbed into the bowl, turn it out onto a counter like this, and then you're just gonna push it, then fold it, then push it, then turn it, and this is called kneading. Then you're gonna keep doing this, it's a little bit of a workout, until the dough ends up smooth. Just keep turning it, folding it, and pushing it. And what you're doing is you're stretching out the gluten strands to strengthen the dough, and if you don't strengthen the dough enough, it won't rise properly. The yeast won't have anything to push up to rise, to let the dough rise, or either that or it will rise flat. It won't rise round like we're gonna do. I'll show you. Okay, so that's with half of the potatoes and the green onions. So now I'm just gonna, you could add them all at the beginning if you want, but I just like to do this because you get more texture out of it, of the potatoes, if you do it in 2 stages like this. But to make your life easier, if you wanted to add them all at once, it will work just fine too. So I'm just gonna push it together just like I'm kneading the dough, just like I showed you before. You know, it could get a little messy, but that's okay. We're just gonna kind of work it in. You don't have to work it in too much, you just have to kind of push the pieces into the dough, really, is all we're doing. And again, I do this for texture. I like to have different textures. So I like the texture of the bread when the potato is mixed in. And I also like the texture of getting a chunk of a potato in the bread when you slice it. Okay. So that looks good to me. Now this recipe is enough for 2 loaves. So you can make one and eat it today, freeze the other one, or if you're like my wife and I, we'll eat it all in one day probably. Because it's nothing better than fresh bread coming out of your own oven. Then, so I cut it in half. Now I'm just gonna push it. This is just gonna help make sure that the dough stays within the shape you want it to stay. So I'm gonna kind of push it into a rectangle shape. Okay, then I'll show you the next step. Then you're gonna roll it up, like you're making a cigar or something. Try to keep the edges as straight as possible. Just kind of push it. You're making a wrap or a cigar or something like that. Okay, so now it's like a round kind of a log. And push it out to the length you want it to be. I want it to be a little longer. Now this is the part I like to do after. Actually, I'll do that after I do this one. It's the same thing. This is like my favorite bread in the world. I make a couple, 4 or 5 types of bread that I've pretty much perfected, and this is one of them. I'm gonna roll it up. Try to make sure they're the same length because you want them to cook at the same rate, because we're going to put them on the same tray. It'll be a lot easier for everybody that way. Okay, so they're about the same length. Then I'm going to take some flour and put it on the board or the counter or whatever you want to call it. And I'm just going to roll the outside in it. This just gives it a little bit of for presentation. And it also, yeah, really just for presentation. Then kind of rid of the extra. Okay, and then we'll do the other one. Roll it in the flour. Make sure you get the ends. Make sure there's enough room between the two so that when they rise, they'll probably at least double before we put them in the oven. Make sure there's enough room in between them like this so that they don't end up touching each other. If they end up touching each other, they won't bake evenly, and you might get the outside might be done, but the inside where they're touching each other may not be cooked all the way, so you gotta make sure that it doesn't do that. And then I like to take a knife and just a little bit. This is again just for presentation. There's really nothing else, none other reason for it, but it just looks cool. And you can do that at this stage, or you could do it after it's risen, but I just think it's almost safer to do it now, because if you do it when it's risen, then you might pop it, you know what I mean? It might fall on you. So when it rises, it will kind of, all the slits that you made will kind of separate from each other. It'll look like a chessboard almost. Okay. Then I turn on my oven to 200 degrees. So it's 200 degrees inside the oven. You can do this especially if it's cold outside like it is today, and it will help with the rising of the dough. You need to put it in a warm place. Cover it with a towel and leave it alone for about 2 hours, and we'll come back. Okay, so it's been about 2 hours for our bread. Excuse the pie here, we're making another video, haha. Our potato scallion bread is doubled in size. I turn it up from 200 degrees to 400 degrees. So we're gonna bake it in a 400 degree oven. I'm using a convection oven, so the time it takes to bake will depend on your oven a little bit. It'll depend on the actual bread itself, the environment it's in, so just keep your eye on it, and I'll show you how to know when it's done, when it's finished baking. And I forgot to mention, when it's at 200 degrees on the top, you're leaving it on the top, you're not putting it in the oven. You're just, the 200 degrees thing is to make it warm on top of the oven to keep it in a good environment for rising the bread. So we're gonna slip this in our oven. It's at 400 degrees, and we'll set our timer for, we'll say 20 minutes to start, and we'll take a look and see how it's going. Okay, we're gonna check our potato scallion bread. It's been baking for about half an hour at 400. I'm gonna show you how to make sure it's done. I checked it already before we started filming this part. Just touch it, make sure it's hard on the outside. It's nice and golden brown all the way around. If you flick it, and it sounds hollow, then it's ready to go. You'd want to make sure you cook it long enough. A lot of people make the mistake of not baking it long enough, and then it falls and it's not cooked in the middle, right? In fear of burning it. Well, I wouldn't be afraid of burning it. I would cook it a little longer versus a little less. That's my preference. So I just make sure, and that way when it cools, it doesn't collapse in the middle like it's doughy, because it's cook it enough in order for it to be cooked through, right? Anyways, so you're gonna cool it on a wire rack, and I know it's tempting to cut into it now. That's another mistake a lot of people make, is cutting into it too soon. So you're gonna let it cool all the way before you can cut into it, or else it will end up doughy also. So we're gonna let it cool, and we'll slice it when it's cooled off. Okay, so our bread is cooled, and I just wanted to slice into it so you could see what it looked like on the inside. That's my daughter in the background. She's home from school.
Yeah.
That look cool? So it's nice soft bread on the inside, and the scallions and just chunks of potato just like we wanted. Looks good to me. Then, you know, the best way to eat fresh bread is just with some salted butter on it. Just like that. Nom 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 nom.